Well, hey there. I'm so happy to see you. I've just been sitting here going through some old photo albums, wishing someone would stop by for a visit to share some fond memories, you know? Do you have a few minutes? Good. Come, pull up a chair. This here photo album, it's all about the early days of our little town, DeFuniak Springs, Florida. Come, let's take a look back and see how it all began. Let's go back to 1882 when 3 railroad executives were surveying for a West Florida railroad line.
Colonel Wright, Major Van Kirk, come on up the hill. I have something you want to see.
Well, just hold your mule, Colonel Chipley. We're coming. Just what up there is so deserving of our attention?
Why, nothing but the prettiest little lake you ever did see. A near-perfect circle with a gentle slope to the grounds all around. Only a few hundred feet from our proposed railroad bed. Well, Colonel, I must agree, it does look to be a fine spot for camping and fishing. No, gentlemen. This spot shall be much more. Here shall a town be built.
And so it was built. A northerner named C.C. Banfield came down and joined the 3 men and proceeded to build a town. Major Van Kirk drew up the plat, still used to this day for one of the earliest planned communities in Florida. He designed it with wide, ample lots surrounding the lake, radiating out in a fan shape to more streets and smaller lots. The sloping ground surrounding the lake formed a vast city park, while alleyways behind the houses allowed for carriage houses in the rear. The business district was situated across the railroad tracks, a convenient walking distance from the residences. Construction started soon after the men's excursion and the completion of the railroad. Now, Ms. P.L. Biddle remembered a lot about this. She wrote that Uncle Buddy Carlton came with his brother W.L. and put up the first building. J.C. Garrett's house was the first residence. Well, about now you're probably wondering how it is that DeFuniak Springs came about its name. Legend has it that Frederick DeFuniak and some other railroad executives were having dinner one evening when they decided they'd flip a coin to see who would get the most desirable railroad stopovers named after them. DeFuniak won the toss, and the little lakeside town had a name. Then one day in 1884, a notice appeared in the Jacksonville Times-Union newspaper declaring that a search party had been sent south to find a suitable locality for a winter Chautauqua. Chautauqua was an institution in New York State that believed in culture, religious education, and improvement of the mind and soul. Mr. C.C. Banfield was sent to Jacksonville at once to try and induce the search party to come to DeFuniak. Dr. Gillett and Reverend McLean of that party returned with him. It rained the whole time, for several days, and there was no hotel and only a few scattered accommodations. But the men looked over the grounds between showers and interviewed the landowners, and were very pleased with the situation and the prospects ahead. In a little while, the arrangements were consummated for the Florida Winter Chautauqua to have its home in DeFuniak Springs. Wallace Bruce and his son Kenneth were chosen to manage the Florida Chautauqua. Under his leadership, Chautauqua grew, and so did the town. Stately Victorian homes were built around the lake yard to house the visitors and for the resident lumbermen and business tycoons. An arts and crafts cottage was built, along with a large tabernacle. Visitors would spend 3 weeks enrolled in artistic and religious courses, with time off to just enjoy the beautiful surroundings. The business district flourished until one day in 1898. The town marshal was awakened in the middle of the night with the terrible news. Mr. Cawthon's store was on fire. Despite the efforts of the townspeople, most of the business went up in flames. They did manage to save the Chautauqua Hotel, though, which had been built a few years earlier. The early 1900s was a booming time in DeFuniak Springs. More homes were built, businesses rebuilt. Mr. Murray put in a merry-go-round for Chautauqua visitors to enjoy. Wallace Bruce built a mansion for entertaining visiting guests and celebrities. The town library, built lakeside in 1887, was gaining membership. But while the men had to pay a quarter to join, the ladies only paid 10 cents. In 1908, the Chautauqua organization built a grand new auditorium that seated 4,000 people. Many churches were built near the circle and in outlying areas. First Baptist Church got a new pastor, the Reverend Sidney J. Katz. Reverend Katz was a colorful character who had much higher aspirations. He ran for and was elected governor of Florida in 1917. His campaign slogan was, "There are only three things a Florida cracker can rely on: Sears Roebuck, the Lord Jesus, and Sidney J. Katz." He bought this fine home and lived in DeFuniak Springs the rest of his days. There was plenty to do in DeFuniak in the early 1900s. You could stay at the New York house, well, until it burned down, or you can order an ice cream sundae and get medical attention from the doctor's office in this drugstore. You could spend a lovely afternoon at Alpine Park, or stroll around the lake. But in the early 1930s, DeFuniak was caught up in the Depression just like everywhere else. Desperation set in, and the once prosperous businessmen looked for investments to bring them out of financial misery. Then in summer of 1931, they got their chance. A company decided to drill for oil just 9 miles south of DeFuniak in Rock Hill. The Herald featured blazing headlines about the good times ahead, while the less sensational Breeze paper hardly even mentioned it. Hopeful businessmen waited for the good news but never got it. Oil never was found in any quantity, and the rig was dismantled and forgotten. The late 40s and 50s were good times in DeFuniak, and many residents have fond memories of them. The Chautauqua Auditorium was bought by the city and used for ball games, high school dances, and other civic activities. The 60s and 70s were not a good time for historic areas, but DeFuniak was lucky. Most of the grand old homes in town were still owned by descendants of the original owners, so they still received regular maintenance, and very few were turned into apartment houses. A general lack of progress during this period served to preserve most of the historic structures, with a few exceptions such as the Chautauqua Hotel. Mother Nature dealt a severe blow, though, in 1975 when Hurricane Eloise took down the nearly restored Chautauqua Auditorium. Fortunately, Eloise left the beautiful entrance facade in repairable condition. The historic preservation movement in the 1980s mobilized the Turnaround Society and the Walton County Heritage Association, which put great effort into preserving the area and preventing progress from destroying history. Now the train depot has been completely restored and turned into a historical museum, and the old Ritz movie house is now used for live theater performances. Recreations of the old-time businesses join with other stores that just never left. The lake yard and the downtown area are great places to just walk around and get a feel for how things used to be. Stop in at the library and they'll demonstrate the antique music box. Visit the Little Big Store, a recreation of a 1920s general store. Be sure and register your opinion at the Opinion Place, which has its own mailbox for important political news. Or just walk out to the lake and feed those hungry ducks. A man would be hard-pressed to find a place as nice to live in or just visit as DeFuniak Springs, Florida.
How the time has flown. I'm parched. Let me get us each a cool glass of lemonade. And then if you're up to it, we'll take a walk around Lake DeFuniak and look at the beautiful old homes. Come on.
This home was built by Malcolm M. Morrison around 1895. He considered this a choice lot because it faced not only the lake but also the railroad. It has 6 fireplaces and 66 windows. In the 1930s and 40s, it was occupied by Colonel W.W. Flournoy and his family. He had a beautiful daughter who became a Powers model in New York and later designed hats for ladies and dogs. Anyway, back to the Morrisons. Their youngest daughter wanted to live close by, so they built her a house very close by, about 3 feet from their house. It had to be squeezed in because they had already let their older daughter Bernice and her judge husband build a home at the far end of their lot. Bernice's husband was D. Stewart Gillis, who was not only a circuit court judge but was later a senator. Their home is the only stucco home considered eligible for the National Historic Register. This classical revival style house was built by a local architect and builder, Duncan Gillis, for his own home. However, it remained unfinished until it was sold by the family in 1945. It has recently received a full renovation. This classical revival style house was also built by a local architect and builder, Duncan Gillis. It was built for the F.Q. Turvin family, and it's the only known house in the area with reverse mansard eaves. This 2-story home was built for Stuart Knox Gillis, a teacher and prominent attorney. Mrs. Gillis stenciled various designs on the walls of the first floor. The house was given to Palmer College in 1931 to be used as the home of its president, about the time this photo was taken. The house has lightning rods at each end of the red tile roof. This home was built for Thomas McConnell, a wealthy turpentine dealer. Double verandas encircle the front and left side of the house. Many years ago, a room in the house was used by a local funeral home for viewing the bodies. The house recently received one of the most comprehensive renovations ever done in DeFuniak. Mr. McConnell also had the house built next door as a wedding present for his daughter. It has beautiful dark wood paneling and woodwork, including this staircase topped off with a stained glass window. The McLean House was built around 1905 for James McLean. It's an example of French colonial style and features a distinctive hip roof. Mr. McLean considered it the best spot on the lake due to the view of the sunset. This house remained in the McLean family for 85 years. Our next house was built around 1905 for Judge Angus Graham Campbell. The house has had only 2 owners in its long history. An interesting detail of this house is the 45-degree cut corner with a window for increased view, light, and air circulation. This house is currently being restored to its original configuration, which had a wraparound porch. This home, circa 1922, was built for the family of John L. McKinnon, author of History of Walton County, which was published in 1911 and referred to often in the production of this video. This house was renovated and remodeled in 1993. This frame vernacular house was built in 1915 for the L.I. Smith family. Dr. Smith and Dr. Albert Dye were owners of a frontier bank in the Dakota Territory before they moved to DeFuniak Springs. Dr. Albert Dye lived next door in this house, which measured over 7,000 square feet with its full basement. At one time, the basement had a full photography darkroom. It was built by Wallace Bruce for the purpose of entertaining Chautauqua VIPs. The home was built of hand-picked lumber from Mrs. Bruce's father's sawmill in Atmore, Alabama. Most of the fireplace mantels are mahogany with classic Greek bas-relief facings. A spacious sunroom is enclosed by sparkling diamond pane glass. This home once held Wallace Bruce's armor collection that now resides in the Lakeside Library. One of the newer homes on Circle Drive is this brick home built in 1938 for Henry Elliott, a local banker. This two-story colonial revival house, circa 1940, is the only two-story brick home on the Circle. The house has an octangular window and a segmented arch pediment. Unlike modern homes, this one is built of solid masonry, not veneer. Built for the James Bullard family in 1910, this frame vernacular home received an extensive remodeling in the 1940s. This home, built in 1887, is named the Magnolia House for the 12 trees on the property that were planted by Malcolm Bruce in the Chautauqua days. In keeping with Southern architectural practices, the original kitchen sat out in the yard, connected by a covered breezeway. There was originally an upper balcony with a projecting gable roof and scrollwork trim. In later years, the house was modified for a more southern appearance. One of the most historically significant homes on the Circle is the Dream Cottage, built for Wallace Bruce for his son Kenneth. Bruce was not only a Chautauqua promoter, but also a former U.S. consul to Scotland. These 4 bells have hung from the front gable for many years. Pictures taken in the early Chautauqua days show us that this is one of the earliest homes in DeFuniak. The Pansy Cottage was, in Chautauqua days, the home of Isabella Alden, writer of more than 100 books and aunt of Grace Livingston Hill. Mrs. Alden, who went by the pen name Pansy, taught classes at Chautauqua along with her husband, the Reverend Alden. At the time of this taping, the Pansy Cottage was vacant and needing serious repair. It is hoped that the cottage will be soon restored to its original configuration, as this early photo shows. Our next 2 homes were purchased from a local store, the McCaskill's One Price Cash Store. This one was built as a model home to show prospective purchasers. The homes were built around 1910. They have triple thick hardwood floors and double walls for extra strength. This home, built around 1889, was once located next door to the Episcopal Parish House, but was moved to this lot prior to 1907. It was then moved again in 1986 when it was repositioned on this lot. It was originally owned by Harry Murray. This home, called the Verandas, is a prime example of folk Victorian style. It has received a painstakingly accurate restoration right down to the type of fencing used. The house still has all the dependencies or outbuildings behind it, including the privy, chicken house, maid's quarters, and coal house. The coal was loaded from the street through these 2 doors. This charming cottage, also known as the Honeymoon Cottage, was built for Colonel T.T. Wright, an early developer of DeFuniak and one of the 3 men who were surveying for the railroad in 1882. It's built in board and batten, folk Victorian style, and has been enlarged considerably from its original size shown here. One of the oldest homes on the Circle, it was later owned by Howard Carthen, whose wife was Governor Sidney Catt's daughter. This 2-story home features special curved corners on its double verandas, created by heating and bending the timbers into shape. It has a lovely diamond-shaped stained glass window on the right side. It was built around 1902 for Walter Graves, a lumberman. The Thomas House, built around 1895, is an outstanding example of Queen Anne style. Special features include a 3-story round turret with conical roof, patterned shingles, and elaborate verge board and truss work. Many of the windows are of leaded glass. In the 1920s, it was purchased by lumberman and banker A.F. Bullard. This home is known as the Charles E. Murray House. Mr. Murray was the owner of the merry-go-round and the first theater in downtown DeFuniak. Does this home look familiar? That's because this home, a few houses back, is virtually identical. The two houses sat side by side for years until the other home was moved a few blocks away. This home is now the parish house for the St. Agatha's Episcopal Church. It served as a boarding house during the Chautauqua era. St. Agatha's Episcopal Church was built in 1896. It's the oldest church building in the city, and as you can see, has some of the most beautiful stained glass windows found anywhere. The pipe organ was built especially for the church in 1985. Prominent realtor R.E.L. McCaskill sold this property to W.J. Davis in 1914. It was built around 1900. Mr. Davis and subsequent owners have made modifications to enlarge the building. Completed in 1909 at a cost of $28,000, the original Chautauqua building had a portico at each end in addition to the three across the front. The porticos were supported by a total of 40 columns representing the 40 existing states. The building, topped by the Lantern of Religious Trust, was called the Hall of Brotherhood. Upstairs classrooms could be opened up to seat 1,000. An auditorium attached to the back of the building seated 4,000, but Hurricane Eloise destroyed the auditorium in 1975. The Burris-Cawthon House is a late Victorian, Edwardian-style home that was built by master craftsman William Dreyer. The Cawthons have been in Walton County since 1824 and built some of the earliest dwellings. Burris-Cawthon was the proprietor of the Big Store on Baldwin Avenue and built his house for his new bride around 1907. The house has an octagonal tower, Doric-style pillars encircling the porch, and a central hip roof with 4 sloping gables. Most of the fireplace mantels are mahogany. This home, called While Away, was built for W.J. Van Kirk, a land agent for the railroad. Van Kirk's original plat of DeFuniak continues to be used today. This house was later owned by Dr. Henry, the first mayor of DeFuniak and a much-loved physician. The Walton DeFuniak Library is the oldest structure in Florida built as a library and still serving that purpose. It was built in 1886 by the Ladies Library Association. The building has been updated and expanded over the years, but it still retains its old-time charm. This building was at one time DeFuniak's Lakeside Hospital. The bottom floor is rented out as professional offices, while the top floor has been creatively converted into a residence. The room where surgery was once performed now serves as a bar. The hospital was originally built in 1938 by Dr. R.B. Spires, who lived next door in this home and practiced medicine in Walton County until his death. This little cottage has quite a history. An original Chautauqua building, the 3-room Octagon Cottage was the arts and crafts shop. It was later used as a child care center for parents attending Chautauqua. In 1910, Wallace Bruce gave the Dream Cottage to his son Malcolm, remodeled this building for his residence, and lived there till his death in 1914. The cottage's eyelid dormer window has been poetically described as being like a half-closed eye, trained lazily on the lake. DeFuniak's L&N Depot was built in 1909, replacing one built earlier. It was recently restored to closely resemble its appearance in the early 1900s, right down to the wood stoves. First Presbyterian Church was organized in 1883. This building replaced the first one, which burned in 1923. It's constructed of petronite blocks, which were made in DeFuniak Springs in the early 1920s. Some of the many notable buildings not located on the circle include Sunbright, the large Queen Anne home once owned by Governor Sidney Katz. Sunbright was built in 1886 and is located right on Highway 331 as you turn towards the historic district. This photo shows how Sunbright appeared at the turn of the century. Camellia Cottage is an excellent example of what a first-class renovation can do for a smaller home. It's named for the many camellias that bloom there each year. The Chautauqua Theater is a completely renovated movie theater that is now used for live theater productions. It's one example of the unusual level of culture in such a small town as DeFuniak Springs. The A.P. Jones House was built around 1885 by the owner of one of DeFuniak's first grocery stores. His store building is shown here next to the Signal newspaper office. The A.P. Jones House is a prime example of decorative folk Victorian style. And last but not least is the DeFuniak Hotel. This renovated building, originally built as a Masonic lodge, now houses a bed and breakfast and restaurant that can't be equaled anywhere at any price.
It's been fun, hasn't it? Thanks for spending the afternoon with me. Maybe we could do this another day. Look through some more photo albums and look back at more of the history of this little treasure, DeFuniak Springs, Florida. Bye now.